Section 11 on comparative longevity in man and the lower animals. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Olga Geiling. On Comparative Longevity in Man and the Lower Animals by E. Ray Lankester. Inductive continued. 1. Man's age, as far as can be gathered by any certain narration, doth exceed the age of all other living creatures, except it be of a few only, and the concomitants in him are very equally disposed, his stature and proportion large, his bearing in the womb 9 months, his fruit commonly one at a birth, his puberty at the age of 14 years, his time of growing till 20. 2. The elephant, by undoubted relation, exceeds the ordinary race of man's life, but his bearing in the womb, the space of 10 years is fabulous, of 2 years or at least above 1 is certain. Now his bulk is great, his time of growth until the 30th year, his teeth exceeding hard, neither hath it been observed that his blood is the coldest of all creatures. His age hath sometimes reached to 200 years. 3. Lions are accounted long livers, because many of them have been found toothless, a sign not so certain, for that may be caused by their strong breath. 4. The bear is a great sleeper, a dull beast, and given to ease, and yet not noted for long life. Nay, he hath this sign of short life, that his bearing in the womb is but short, scarce full 40 days. 5. The fox seems to be well disposed in many things for long life. He is well skinned, feeds on flesh, lives in dens, and yet he is noted not to have that property. Certainly he is a kind of dog, and that kind is but short-lived. 6. The camel is a long liver, a lean creature and sinewy, so that he doth ordinarily attain to 50 and sometimes to 100 years. 7. The horse lives but to a moderate age, scarce to 40 years. His ordinary period is 20 years, but perhaps he is beholden for this shortness of life to man. For we have now no horses of the sun that live freely, and at pleasure in good pastures. Notwithstanding, the horse grows till he be 6 years old, and is able for generation in his old age. Besides, the mare goeth longer with her young one than a woman, and brings forth 2 at a burthen more rarely. The ass lives commonly to the horse's age, but the mule outlives them both. 8. The hart is famous amongst men for long life, yet not upon any relation that is undoubted. They tell of a certain hart that was found with a collar about its neck, and that collar hidden with fat. The long life of the hart is less credible, because he comes to his perfection at the 5th year, and not long after his horns, which he sheds and renews yearly, grow more narrow at the root, and less branched. 9. The dog is but a short liver. He exceeds not the age of 20 years, and for the most part lives not to 14 years. A creature of the hottest temper, and living in extremes, for he is commonly either in vehement motion or sleeping. Besides, the bitch bringeth forth many at a burden, and goeth 9 weeks. 10. The ox likewise, for the greatness of his body and strength, is but a short liver, about some 16 years, and the males live longer than the females. Notwithstanding, they bear usually but 1 at a burden, and go 9 months, a creature dull, fleshy, and soon fatted, and living only upon hereby substances, without grain. 11. The sheep seldom lives to 10 years, though he be a creature of a moderate size, and excellently clad, and, that which may seem a wonder, being a creature with so little a gall. Yet he hath the most curled coat of any other, for the hair of no creature is so much curled as wool is. The rams generate not before the 3rd year, and continue able for generation until the 8th. The ewes bear young as long as they live. The sheep is a diseased creature, and rarely lives to his full age. 12. The goat lives to the same age with the sheep, and is not much unlike in other things, though he be a creature more nimble, and of somewhat a firmer flesh, and so should be longer lived. But then he is much more lascivious, and that shortens his life. 13. The sow lives to 15 years, sometimes to 20, and though it be a creature of the moistest flesh, yet that seems to make nothing to length of life. Of the wild boar or sow, we have nothing certain. 14. The cat's age is betwixt 6 and 10 years. A creature nimble and full of spirit, whose seed, as alien reports, burneth the female, whereupon it is said that the cat conceives with pain, and brings forth with ease. A creature ravenous in eating, rather swallowing down his meat whole than feeding. 15. Hares and conies attain scarce to 7 years, being both creatures generative, and with young ones of several conceptions in their bellies. In this they are unlike, that the coney lives underground, and the hare above ground, and again, that the hare is of a more duskish flesh. 16. Birds, for the size of their bodies, are much lesser than beasts, for an eagle or swan is but a small thing, in comparison of an ox or horse, and so is an ostrich to an elephant. 17. Birds are excellently well clad, for feathers, for warmth and close sitting to the body, exceed wool and hairs. 18. Birds, though they hatch many young ones together, yet they bear them not all in their bodies at once, but lay their eggs by turns, whereby their fruit hath the more plentiful nourishment, whilst it is in their bodies. 19. Birds chew little or nothing, but their meat is found whole in their crops. Notwithstanding, they will break the shells of fruit, and pick out the kernels. They are thought to be of a very hot and strong concoction. 20. The motion of birds in their flying is a mixed motion, consisting of a moving of the limbs, and of a kind of carriage, which is the most wholesome kind of exercise. 21. Aristotle noted well, touching the generation of birds, but he transferred it ill to other living creatures, that the seed of the male confers less to generation than the female, but that it rather affords activity than matter, so that fruitful eggs and unfruitful eggs are hardly distinguished. 22. Birds, almost all of them, come to their full growth the first year, or a little after. It is true that their feathers in some kinds, and their bills in others, show their years, but for the growth of their bodies it is not so. 23. The eagle is accounted a long liver, yet his years are not set down, and it is alleged as the sign of his long life that he casts his bill, whereby he grows young again, from whence comes that old proverb, the old age of an eagle. Notwithstanding, perchance the matter may be thus, that the renewing of the eagle doth not cast his bill, but the casting of his bill is the renewing of the eagle, for, after that his bill is grown to a great crookedness, the eagle feeds with much difficulty. 24. Vultures are also affirmed to be long livers, insomuch that they extend their life well near to 100 years. Kites likewise, and so all birds that feed upon flesh, and birds of prey live long. As for hawks, because they lead a degenerate and servile life for the delight of men, the term of their natural life is not certainly known. Notwithstanding, amongst mewed hawks, some have been found to have lived 30 years, and amongst wild hawks 40 years. 25. The raven likewise is reported to live long, sometimes to 100 years. He feeds on carrion, and flies not often, but rather is a sedentary and melancholic bird, and hath very black flesh. But the crow, like unto him in most things, except in greatness and voice, lives not altogether so long, and yet is reckoned amongst the long livers. 26. The swan is certainly found to be a long liver, and exceeds not unfrequently 100 years. He is a bird excellently plumed, a feeder upon fish, and is always carried, and that in running waters. 27. The goose also may pass amongst the long livers, though his food be commonly grass and such kind of nourishment, especially the wild goose, whereupon this proverb grew amongst the Germans, magis senex quam uncernivalis, older than a wild goose. 28. Storks must needs be long livers, if that be true which was anciently observed of them, that they never came to Thebes, because that city was often sacked. This, if it were so, then either they must have the knowledge of more ages than one, or else the old ones must tell their young the history. But there is nothing more frequent than fables. 29. For fables do so abound touching the phoenix, that the truth is utterly lost, if any such bird there be. As for that which was so much admired, that she was ever seen abroad with a great troop of birds about her, it is no such wonder, for the same is usually seen about an owl flying in the daytime, or a parrot let out of a cage. 30. The parrot hath been certainly known to have lived 80 years in England, how old soever he was before he was brought over, a bird eating almost all kind of meats, chewing his meat and renewing his bill, likewise cursed and mischievous, and of a black flesh. 31. The peacock lives 20 years, but he comes not forth with his Argus eyes before he be 3 years old, a bird slow of pace, having whitish flew. 32. The dunghill cock is venereous, martial, and but of a short life, a crank bird, having also white flesh. 33. The Indian cock, commonly called the turkey cock, lives not much longer than the dunghill cock, an angry bird, and hath exceeding white flesh. 34. The ringdoves are of the longest sort of livers, insomuch that they attain sometimes to 50 years of age, an airy bird, and both builds and sits on high. But doves and turtles are but short-lived, not exceeding 8 years. 35. But pheasants and partridges may live to 16 years. They are great breeders, but not so white of flesh as the ordinary pullen. 36. The blackbird is reported to be, amongst the lesser birds, one of the longest livers, an unhappy bird and a good singer. 37. The sparrow is noted to be of a very short life, and it is imputed in the males to their lasciviousness. But the linnet, no bigger in body than the sparrow, hath been observed to have lived 20 years. 38. Of the ostrich we have nothing certain. Those that were kept here have been so unfortunate that no long life appeared by them. Of the bird ibis, we find only that he liveth long, but his years are not recorded. 39. The age of fishes is more uncertain than that of terrestrial creatures, because living under the water they are the less observed. Many of them breathe not, by which means their vital spirit is more closed in, and therefore, though they receive some refrigeration by their gills, yet that refrigeration is not so continual as when it is by breathing. 40. They are free from the desiccation and depredation of the air ambient, because they live in the water, yet there is no doubt but the water, ambient and piercing, and received into the pores of the body, doth more hurt to long life than the air doth. 41. It is affirmed, too, that their blood is not warm. Some of them are great devourers, even of their own kind. Their flesh is softer and more tender than that of terrestrial creatures. They grow exceedingly fat, insomuch that an incredible quantity of oil will be extracted out of one whale. 42. Dolphins are reported to live about 30 years, of which thing a trial was taken in some of them by cutting off their tails. They grow until 10 years of age. 43. That which they report of some fishes is strange, that after a certain age their bodies will waste and grow very slender, only their head and tail retaining their former greatness. 44. There were found in Caesar's fish ponds lampreys to have lived 60 years. They were grown so familiar with long use that Crassus, the orator, solemnly lamented one of them. 45. The pike amongst fishes, living in fresh water, is found to last longest, sometimes to 40 years. He is a ravener, of a flesh somewhat dry and firm. 46. But the carp, bream, tench, eel, and the like, are not held to live above 10 years. 47. Salmons are quick of growth, short of life. So are trouts, but the perch is slow of growth, long of life. 48. Touching that monstrous bulk of the whale or orc, how long it is whaled by vital spirit, we have received nothing certain. Neither yet touching the sea calf and sea hog, and other innumerable fishes. 49. Crocodiles are reported to be exceeding long-lived, and are famous for the times of their growth, for that they, amongst all other creatures, are thought to grow during their whole life. They are of those creatures that lay eggs, ravenous, cruel, and well fenced against the waters. Touching the other kinds of shellfish, we find nothing certain how long they live. Source: Basil Montague's translation of Bacon's works, The History of Life and Death. Let us first examine the facts given above in view of the relation of high evolution or high individuation to longevity. It is apparent that the longest-lived animals and trees are those of high development, and not only generally, but in comparing the members of a class or order, this is found to be true. Thus we see the great trees, exhibiting no doubt the greatest bulk and greatest differentiation among plants, as having the longest life. The vertebrata, which are the highest in evolution of animals, are as a whole the longest lived, for the mollusca and crustacea and echinodermata, though, as stated in the list, they are not known to have a definite limit of life, yet certainly do not, on the whole, exhibit anything like so great a potential longevity as the vertebrata. Again, amongst the vertebrata, the longest lived are found in the mammalia, and the whale and the elephant, living respectively 300 and 150 years, are the largest, and in this special characteristic, as highly evolved as any of the class. Footnote: Mr. Herbert Spencer says, in Principles of Biology, Volume 2, page 479, the elephant, which thought otherwise less evolved, is in extent of integration more evolved, i.e., as compared with man. End of footnote. Then, side by side, we see the whale longer lived than the elephant on account of its greater bulk, man longer lived than the chimpanzee, being larger and more highly differentiated. Footnote: Mr. Alfred Wallace told the writer that he knew nothing contrary to the supposition that the orangutan lives as long as the human inhabitants of Borneo. This shows the difficulty there is in observing in regard to the question of longevity. End of footnote. The ox longer lived than the sheep and goat, the lion than the ox, being although not bulkier, yet of higher development. So the small rodents and insectivora have short lives, the mouse being said to live a shorter time than larger allied forms. It would be interesting to know as to the longevity of marsupials, whether their lower evolution tells strongly on their longevity, or whether bulk affects it most. The large kangaroo, where longevity regulated by bulk alone, should live longer than the sheep. The reptiles present intersay the same relations. The crocodiles and chelonia, which are certainly those of greatest individuation, being longest lived. So too the fishes, as far as facts go, the pike being a highly evolved fish, The sharks may be guessed from their great size to have very long lives, which confirms the rule as to high development, though of course it cannot as to bulk. That bulk and development increase together is well ascertained from general principles. The sharks of the later tertiary period are calculated from the size of their teeth to have measured between 80 and 90 feet in length, and may have had a proportionate longevity. Speculation might lead one to attribute enormous longevity to the gigantic extinct Mesozoic reptiles. Amongst mollusca, the highest in evolution are the highest in longevity. If we may judge by the size and rate of growth of some cephalopods, both recent and extinct, as compared with conchifers and brachiopods, the insects inter se present facts supporting the truth of the proposition as to high evolution. The Coleoptera and Orthoptera, undoubtedly from their carnivorous habits, in many cases, and generally dominant character, the most highly evolved, are the longest lived, according to observation, e.g. Scarabaeus and Mantis. Amongst birds, the most striking case is seen in the exceeding longevity, which is well ascertained of parrots. They are undoubtedly the very highest of birds in development, and they live probably the longest. The facts as to age do not, however, relate to their normal potential longevity. We have to guess that from the experiment in abnormal conditions. Next, as to generative expenditure. Footnote. It does not appear worthwhile to consider asexual and sexual genesis separately, where so little is to be said. But it does appear from the facts that asexual genesis is less severe a tax, and therefore less inimical to longevity than sexual genesis. Thus, Catogaster and other worms live and reproduce asexually in abundance, but at length sexual genesis occurs and they die. It is in those cases where asexual genesis partakes of the nature of growth rather than germ production that it is least severe in its effect on longevity. End of footnote. Since this generally and clearly increases with diminished evolution, it is not difficult to establish the contrast between it and high longevity as a general rule. The protozoa and protophyta are exceedingly prolific, an infusorian being calculated to produce 268 millions in the course of a single month, paramecium, another 170 billions in 4 days, and their duration of life is correspondingly of the shortest. Insects are exceedingly prolific, and hence, in spite of their high evolution, very short-lived. Many insects deposit 300,000 ova, but what is a more important item of consideration, they deposit an enormous bulk relatively to their living matter. Compare the not far distant but inferior annelids, and they are seen to be longer lived, for though in most cases possessing large genital organs, they do not deposit their ova or sperm so early or so rapidly as the insects. The vertebrata are by no means prolific, except fish, and at the same time are longer lived than invertebrata. Fish are long-lived, in spite of considerable generative expenditure, the explanation lying in the diminished personal expenditure involved in their aquatic life. Footnote. The bulk of the ova and sperm in fish is not so large as the number of the ova lead one to think, and moreover, as a rule, they give no parental attention, which is a most important item of generative expenditure. In those fishes which do, e.g. pipefish, hippocampus, and Aries of the Amazons, the bulk and number of the ova is immensely reduced. This item of parental attention is what in the case of man and other animals tends much to balance the male and female generative expenditure, for the male feeds both mother and young for a considerable time by his exertion. Hence the female's expenditure of substance is in some degree balanced. End of footnote. This too affects greatly the case of annelids just quoted. Amongst birds, it is easy to point out that smaller broods go with a greater longevity. Thus the eagle has but 1 or 2 eggs, the common owl 4 or 5, finches 2 broods of 5 in a season, and the wrens and tits 8 to 15, and these, as appears from our list above, stand in the same order as to longevity. It is very difficult indeed to find particular cases in which the direct action of generative expenditure on longevity is apparent, for it affects other quantities before longevity, or its action is counteracted by fluctuations in these quantities, as, for example, in personal expenditure and degree of evolution. One ought to compare organisms which are alike in these 2 last quantities. In trees, we may take the pear, apple, and such fruit trees, and we find that they are excessive in their reproductive expenditure, and short-lived as compared with other trees, which agree, as do all vegetals, in the absence of personal expenditure, and are of equivalent individuation. In animals, we may best compare experimental cases. Footnote: the case of actinia is alluded to farther on. Its longevity is an example where small generative expenditure, either asexual or sexual, entails long duration of the individual. End of footnote. Thus we find that animals used for breeding, and made to breed early, are less long-lived than those which are not so used. Footnote: this statement is derived from general assertions and needs confirmation. End of footnote. There are, besides, 2 important cases to compare, viz. Mules which are born incapable of reproducing, and animals which have been operated upon. With regard to the mule, Bacon states that it lives longer than either the horse or the ass, which confirms the hypothesis that generative expenditure antagonizes longevity. But as to the result of operations, it appears that, as in cases of forced abstinence, a disturbing element is introduced by the interference with the proper functions and nutrition of the animal. The principle of Treviranus, that every organ is as an excreting gland to the rest of the body, must be remembered, and we can comprehend that by the removal of generative glands, no advantage as to longevity would accrue to the organism, but perhaps great injury, whilst the abeyance of normal functions will equally not prevent that nutrition of the organs and their growth, which is a great part of the tax of generative expenditure. At the same time, both castrated organisms and those restrained from the sexual act gain in the possible absence of nervous excitement, which has a relatively enormous costliness, source Spencer, and by not losing the simple weight of the emitted generative product. It does not appear from facts that castrated animals are longer lived than those normal, neither amongst men nor lower animals, nor that celibates, male or female, among either men or lower animals, have a large if any advantage. Footnote: it is exceedingly difficult to make estimations as to male celibates. The unmarried have a considerably higher death rate at ages below 50 among males than the married, but there are not statistics to show that of the number surviving there is a less expectation of life than among the married or widowers. It is impossible to be assured of the strict abstinence of any group of men. Amongst women, the oldest are widows, but the relative ages of marriage of males and females, and the numbers of married and unmarried, affect these numbers vastly, and their influence cannot yet be eliminated. End of footnote. Passing on to personal expenditure, we find more numerous facts in the list to support our deductions. Aquatic animals generally have less personal expenditure than terrestrial animals. They are supported in the water, the temperature fluctuates little, their food is abundant, for waters teem with life, truly more than the atmosphere. Terrestrial animals, while supporting themselves mostly on the ground, live in the air, and in very few cases is their food to be found abundantly in this medium. and accordingly their expenditure in getting food is greater. Thus, among vertebrata, the whale is long-lived, the crocodiles and chelonians are long-lived, the salamandroids and the fish. It does not appear certain that the batrachia, frogs, and toads are shorter-lived than the salamandroids. Their terrestrial habits involved greater expenditure, but their very much higher individuation may counterbalance this. Among invertebrata, the mollusca are long-lived, the pulmonata less so than the branchiate gasteropods. Paludina and limnaeus, living in the same pond, differ thus in age, whilst no land mollusk is as large, and therefore probably from what we have seen as long-lived, as many hundreds of aquatic marine species. Footnote: as far as the writer's observations go, Limnaeus lives 4 years, and Paludina 7 or 8. End of footnote. The aquatic arthropods, crustacea, excluding the minuter forms, are most broadly contrasted with the terrestrial insects, myriapods, and arachnids, in respect of length of life, as we have before mentioned and set forth in the list. Descending lower, we find no terrestrial groups to compare. Footnote: there is the terrestrial leech, and there are the terrestrial planariae, or ground flukes, the longevity of which is not ascertained. End of footnote. Reptiles living in hot countries, and feeding on large masses of food at intervals, have small expenditure and live long. The higher reptiles are the most sluggish and inert of any animals in proportion to their degree of development, and hence, their expenditure being small, and their development high, we should expect them to exhibit great longevity, which they do. A very instructive contrast is afforded by birds and reptiles, which are so closely allied in structure. The active, expending birds are short-lived as compared with such reptiles as the tortoise and crocodile. Echinoderms, being exceedingly sluggish, living on the most easily obtainable food in many cases, viz. The organic matter diffused in sand, live longer than would be expected from their comparatively low place in the scale of life. Actinia, which is also almost like a vegetal as to absence of personal expenditure, as are other sedentary coelenterates, owes its great longevity to a relatively high evolution in respect of integration. It buds never, or rarely, and breeds sexually but little. The parasitic worms and crustacea might be expected to have a great longevity from the total absence of personal expenditure, but here, as in many plants, there is enormous generative expenditure which shortens life, the small percentage of those born which ever get into the happy conditions of a stomach or gill, being the reason for this great generative outlay. Most of these forms die on reproduction. Taenia does not die at once, because of its tertiary aggregation, that is to say, it is separated into a number of joints, which, one by one, come to maturity and die, whilst new joints continue to grow from the head. These are some of the most striking inductive verifications which the collected statements furnish. Others are to be found by a further examination of the list. End of section 11.